Welcome to Todd Talk. Today I'm going to tell you my top 40 favorite films.
Todd Talk is brought to you by Blow Bros. Boba Loba knows.
So what's your favorite movie? You know, that's a really, really tough question for a lot of different reasons. For one, it's super subjective. What one person likes versus what another person likes. But then there's also like my favorite movie when I was a 20-year-old is totally different than my favorite movie when I was a 30-year-old. And then there's just the fact that like some movies, like I love some really terrible movies. And also there are some really fantastic movies that I've seen and I never need to see them again. You know, sometimes there's something about a movie that just really resonates with you or reminds you of a certain person or time in your life, and that kind of thing is just really, really impossible to quantify. Originally, I imagined doing a top 10 list for you all. But when I started making the list, it was just too hard. So I made a list of all the films that I just loved for whatever reason. And then I went through and I cut out the ones that, like, if I never got to see them again, I'd be okay. And I cut out the holiday films. And when I was done, I was left with 40 movies, and I'm going to share those with you. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to tear through them and give you a real quick why. And just to be clear, these are in no particular order. So the first film, Vertigo. I saw this movie pretty young, and for whatever reason, it just really stuck with me. It's a cool movie, a pretty interesting story, and just the way he puts it together is just absolutely masterful. It's a great film. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. This movie is a fever dream. It's a great Gene Wilder performance. The kids are great, but there's just so much weirdness in this as far as like the dude at the beginning with like the knife cart, and then that whole boat ride, and the weird shamey Oompa Loompa songs. It's just a bizarre and fantastic film. Jaws. Even though it was made a long time ago and the effects are a little shoddy, it's just a brilliant story, and it's really, really well told. That moment where they're all kind of drunk and hanging out on the boat is just like one of the best scenes in a movie ever. Blazing Saddles. The racial and stereotype stuff in this film is so front and center. And really, that's the point of it, is really an examination of racism through the lens of a Western comedy. And its self-awareness and the way that it sort of breaks the fourth wall, it's a fantastic movie. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a really great light sci-fi movie. By today's standards, it's a little slow on its back half, but it has some really great moments that hold up, and its effects are surprisingly good. Star Wars. And when I say Star Wars, I mean that first movie that came out in 1977. It's a brilliant hero's journey, and it is the thing that sprouted all of the rest of this. It was enough of a movie, enough world building that you wanted more. And while this more has been kind of hit and miss, you know, that original idea, that original seed is still so good all these years later. Ghostbusters. You know, honestly, it's almost a perfect film. Aside from that one like ghost blowjob scene, it's a really good story. It's a great performance from Bill Murray. It's just so endearing, and it holds up really well even all these years later. Clue. It's just one of those movies that if I'm home and I don't feel good and I turn on the TV and it's on, I'm absolutely going to sit through it. It was shot with 3 different endings, and back in the day when they released it in theaters, when you went to see it, you didn't know which one you were going to get to see. But now when you watch it, they actually show you all 3 of the endings. Blue Velvet. There's a couple of David Lynch films on my list. I absolutely love David Lynch movies, and Blue Velvet is the first one that really kind of captured what David Lynch is all about. His movies all have this theme of where things that look pure are not quite as pure as you think they are once you look under the surface. This movie really captures that idea. And when you look at lists of like the best villains in movies, Frank from Blue Velvet shows up on those lists right next to Darth Vader and Hannibal Lecter all the time. It's a really great movie. Casablanca. I remember when I first heard about this movie just thinking, it's one of those films that came out a long time ago and everybody knows the Play It Again, Sam, or whatever. It's really, really well done and just a great, great film. The Untouchables. Brian De Palma's had a really weird career. There's actually a documentary about him and his career, and it's absolutely fascinating. There's a lot of really great performances in this film and a couple of scenes that are absolutely brilliant. Really worth a watch. Moonrise Kingdom. Wes Anderson is absolutely an auteur as far as filmmaking goes. There's not a lot of people who are as recognizable as Wes Anderson as far as their style or the way they compose a film. The Princess Bride. It's sort of just a little silly fantasy fairy tale told through the lens of a grandfather reading it to his grandson who's sick in bed. The characters in this film are all so wonderful and relatable, and just the whimsy and the silliness of the story really hold up over the years. Beetlejuice. Tim Burton's made a bunch of great films, but this particular one I think is, in my opinion, his masterpiece. Field of Dreams. This movie's kind of hard to pin down. It's sort of a family drama. It's a little bit of a ghost story. It's a little weird and a little corny, but if you can suspend disbelief just a little bit, it's really, really worth your time. Groundhog Day. Another absolutely brilliant Bill Murray performance. It's a fantastic story that has been copied many times since, but this is really that kind of original idea of what if you were stuck and you had to do it over and over again? And it's a nice examination of humanity and morality, and it really, kind of makes you think about what would you do? And oh my gosh, what did he do? And it's just a really, really fantastic film. Pulp Fiction. Quentin Tarantino is one of the greatest filmmakers of our time. No denying that. He's made many, many really great films, and there's a couple on this list. But in my opinion, this is the first one that really catalyzed what he was all about. Reservoir Dogs was great, but Pulp Fiction really cemented that non-linear kind of idea of all these characters relating in a way that you don't quite understand until you get to the very end of the movie, and then it all sort of cements and ties together. Breakfast at Tiffany's. A little bit of a controversial choice because in the movie there is a white actor who plays an Asian character in kind of an ugly way. Now, that being said, it's sort of an interesting broken love story with these really cool characters. There's a musical number in it, which is really kind of bizarre. Just a great movie. The Usual Suspects. Now, Kevin Spacey is not a great human being, but this film is perhaps the best crime heist film ever made. The Shawshank Redemption. In my opinion, this is the first great Stephen King adaptation. There have been a lot of movies based on Stephen King stories that have been turned into films, but many of them were terrible or really, really changed from the original source material. This one was really, really faithful, and it was directed by Frank Darabont, who went on to do a lot of really great Stephen King adaptations. It's not really a horror story unless you consider being jailed for a crime you didn't commit horror. But it's just a great story with really fantastic characters and just a lot of humanity. The Lost Highway. Another David Lynch film. This film is very 90s. The look, the soundtrack, all just have that kind of 90s feel. Now, one theme I had mentioned with David Lynch is that idea of that ugliness that lives under that veil of purity. Another thing that David Lynch is very into is the idea of changing identity. You know, what if you could be this person? How would your perception change? This film is really bizarre and really raw and makes you think about a lot of those concepts. The Matrix. The sequels weren't great, but that first film, all by itself, was a brilliant hero's journey for the 21st century. It is such a good film, and the world that it built was absolutely brilliant. The Shining. Stanley Kubrick has made a lot of great films, but like I was saying, they're films that I don't think I ever need to see again. Full Metal Jacket, as an example, is just a grueling and brutal depiction of war, and I've seen it, and I just don't need to ever see that again. Now, The Shining, it creates this really bizarre and very spooky world that is kind of fun and hypnotic to inhabit. It's not a great Stephen King adaptation. Stanley Kubrick took a lot of liberties with the story, but the story he created was really good. True Romance. This is an interesting movie because the script was written by Quentin Tarantino, but it was directed by Tony Scott. And as a result, it has a really different feel than like a Tarantino movie. The whole thing is sort of a weird, gritty romance. This kind of nerdy character falls in love with a prostitute and they run off together and get wrapped up in some mob crime drama. Everybody is in this movie. Christian Slater, Christopher Walken, Dennis Hopper, Gary Oldman, Brad Pitt. It's a wild journey and it's really, really worth a watch. Fight Club. It's a really interesting story that examines masculinity and society and power. And the way that it's directed really makes you feel like you're part of the story as you go through it. American Psycho. This is another movie based on a novel in that 90s, 2000 era. For whatever reason, it's just a joy to follow this crazy person through this world that he inhabits. Young Frankenstein. Yeah, the whole thing's a dick joke, but it's a really good dick joke. The whole thing is just amazing, and I laugh every time I watch it. Galaxy Quest. It's a really simple and relatable story, but it's just wonderful and brilliant, and every time I watch it, I have a good time. Memento. It's the first movie done by Christopher Nolan that ended up on my radar. Just a great example of innovative filmmaking. And just the whole story is told in a really compelling and interesting way. Donnie Darko. It is one of the very best time travel stories, in my opinion. Most time travel stories are garbage. I'll make a whole different video about that. But this one is just really kind of fun and sad and just an interesting story that you get taken on. Mulholland Drive. This might be my favorite movie. Like I said earlier, I love David Lynch. I just love the feeling and the world that he creates in his films. All of these themes that he's explored in his other films sort of come together in this movie in a story that is absolutely gorgeous and terrifying. And it's just such a neat place that he takes you. The Ring. The American version, Gore Verbinski did such a good job of just creating this atmosphere and this feeling, and it is gross and oppressive and terrifying. did a really good job of just freaking me out. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now, I mentioned Pulp Fiction being where Quentin Tarantino really found himself. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is the result of just absolute mastery over his art. The Prestige. This is one of my very favorite Christopher Nolan movies. Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale as competing magicians. The places this narrative takes you are so surprising, and the movie is a magic trick in itself. It is absolutely worth a watch. Hot Rod. This is the funniest movie that has ever been made, ever. Let the Right One In. This is a really, really original Swedish vampire film. It's about a little boy who befriends a little girl who happens to be a vampire. It's a really weird and spooky and kind of sweet story. And if you've never seen it, I highly recommend. Inception. So far for me, this has been the pinnacle of Christopher Nolan's work. Christopher Nolan is really good at sort of smart, over-the-top action movies. I was kind of on the fence on whether to go with Inception or Tenet. I feel like Tenet just isn't quite as strong of a film. While there are some really amazing and compelling scenes in Tenet, Inception is just a better story all the way through. The Cabin in the Woods. When the advertisements for this movie came out, it just looked like a bunch of teenagers going out to a cabin in the woods and being attacked by a bunch of zombies. But as soon as you start watching this movie, it gets flipped on its head so fast, and it is such an original and fun idea. Really, really recommend it. Arrival. The entire time I was sitting there watching it, I felt like I was a part of it. The dread of the unknown and these aliens coming to our world, and this character trying to figure out how to connect or communicate with them. And such a good kind of lesson in patience and morality. And I just absolutely loved it. The Grand Budapest Hotel. I love how it is sort of nested as a story within a story within a story. And it just really feels just really heartfelt and really important. And that's my list. So leave me a comment. Let me know what some of your favorite movies are, and I'll see you next time.